for those who don't know who I am, I'm the director of the School of Journalism and Media Studies here at SDSU. And I'm very excited to be kicking off the spring semester with today's events. And to let you know that we're going to have a lot of events like this coming up. And you'll hear more about that soon. And it's really perfect to me that we're kicking off with Armen Keteyian. Not only is he one of our graduates, which of course makes it special, but he is an 11-time Emmy Award winner and a New York Times best-selling author, and of course now executive producer of an HBO documentary. So, after graduating from SDSU, he began working in print as an investigative reporter at the most prestigious sports print magazine, Sports Illustrated. And he worked his way up through network news and cable television sports assignments at the highest level, including CBS Sports, the NFL Today, and 60 Minutes. Expanding beyond sports, he reached a new level in his career as Chief Investigative Reporter for the CBS Evening News, where he was nominated 5 times and won 3 Emmy Awards. In 2018, Armen authored the New York Times bestseller, Tiger Woods, which was based on hundreds of interviews. We'll talk about that in just a moment. And then that book, of course, was turned into an HBO documentary, which you can watch right now on HBO and HBO Max. I'm going to begin asking him some questions about Tiger Woods, about the documentary, about his career, but in just a little while, I'll be opening it up for questions. So feel free to drop comments, use the Q&A box to ask any questions that you have, and we'll circle around to those in just a little bit. So let me welcome Armen again. Thank you so much for being with us today. And I want to start with the book. So we know you've got this HBO documentary, and I'm sure a lot of people are excited to talk about that because I really enjoyed it. My wife, who does not particularly like sports and definitely not golf, got sucked in when I was watching it. And so I think I want to talk about that, but we should start with the book since the documentary is based on the book, which came out in 2018. And how I actually want to go is you just heard, of course, your career. You're a very successful journalist. What made you interested in writing a book, which is longer than any normal long form journalism, a book for one, and a book about Tiger Woods in particular, a huge celebrity, so much information out there. What drew you to that story?
Well, let me start by just saying thank you to everybody that showed up. It looks like there's like 65 people in this class right now, and I know, having gone to San Diego State in the 70s, what Friday afternoons are like at around 12 o'clock. So I appreciate everybody taking the time to listen in today. To answer your question, Temple, it's a arduous task. It's a huge mountain to climb when you're writing a book. And fortunately, Tiger was number 11 for me, and Jeff Benedict, my co-author, had written, I think, 13 or 14 to that point in time. So between the two of us, we had done almost 25 nonfiction books. So we knew what we were getting into, so to speak. We were just coming off a book called The System, which was a very deep dive into college football, big time college football programs. That took us 2 years. And the proposal for The System that went out to the publishers was 60 pages long. So we gave them a very detailed prospect and pitch as to what we thought was going to end up in the book. By contrast, the Tiger Woods proposal was 4 pages long. And you go, wow, he's had such a huge life. Why would it only be 4 pages? Well, first of all, Jeff and I looked, and when our agent said to us, I think you should do a book about Tiger Woods, we're like, haven't there been enough books about Tiger Woods? I mean, by that point in time, there had been at least 10 books written. His father had written 2 or 3. Tiger had written or co-written 2 of his own. A number of very prominent sports writers, golf writers, had done books about Tiger when he turned pro, and Tiger when he had his great run in 2000, and then Tiger after the crash in 2009, sort of the aftermath in the fall. But what we discovered was, in doing our research, was there had never been this immersive 360-degree look at Tiger's life. And particularly, the father-son aspect and the father-mother-son aspect of it. So based on our reputations and based upon our investigative skills, Simon & Schuster bought the book. And most importantly to us, it was, we wanted 3 years. We knew it was going to take us at least a year to just do the groundwork, the spade work that was necessary in order to understand everything that had gone on in Tiger's life. And we started to put a timeline together. The second year was really a heavy reporting year, where we found people that had never really talked about their experience with Tiger. It took us a year sometimes to gain the trust and the friendship of people that we knew we wanted to talk to. And then the final year was really the writing of the book. And by that time, we knew kind of where we wanted to go. But even then, you're dealing with a subject like Tiger, who has spent his entire life constructing a certain mythology about his life. And we knew he was going to be a really tough nut to crack, sort of psychologically, to understand. And I'll end by just saying, we were really driven by two questions. And, who is Tiger Woods, which a lot of people had written about, but no one had really tried to portray it in a way that people could understand sort of the psychology of his upbringing. And then the second question was, what's the price of genius? And, we had all witnessed his awe-inspiring feats on the golf course, but at what price? And, when you're talking about extreme fame and fortune and $100 million a year in off-course commercial endorsements, there was a lot of baggage to unpack with Tiger. And in the end, thank you very much. I mean, it was wildly successful. It was a #1 New York Times bestseller. And then getting to sort of the doc, just to help you, is like, Alex Gibney, who was a Oscar-winning film director, documentarian. He bought the rights to Tiger Woods almost as soon as it came out. And then we were kind of off and running then with pitching it to various streaming services and cable networks. And in the end, it came down between Netflix and HBO. And then during that period of time, Netflix was buying everything. And HBO, to our astonishment, outbid Netflix for the doc. And then from there, kind of we were off and running.
And can you talk a little bit about the process of writing the book, and in particular, for journalism students or professionals, getting those interviews? Because you have both in the book and then also again in the documentary, access to people who really knew Tiger well. I mean, I think, his former caddy as an example of somebody who spent a lot of time with him. And so how were you able to reach out to them and then gain that trust that you're not writing, you're not a hit piece or trying to be
Right.
too much of an expose or something like that?
Well, I said to people, if I wanted to write, a schlock book on Tiger, kind of a catch and kill I wouldn't have taken 3 years of my life to do it. I could have done it in a year, and then you just go for the salacious, superficial, sensational kind of reporting. But that's just never been, I've never been that way as a journalist, and I never will be. But it's a process. It really is like almost, we used to think about it. I think about it in terms of a puzzle. If you just figure, some people, when you're doing a story, there might be 10 puzzle pieces there, and you can put that puzzle together very quickly. Others are 100 pieces, others are 1,000. Tiger, in many ways, was like a 10,000 piece puzzle, but you didn't even know what the pieces were. You knew certain pieces. You had the Earl piece and the Tita piece, and you wanted to talk to Butch Harmon and Hank Haney and Stevie Williams and Mark O'Meara and really prominent people in his life that had been certainly well publicized. But it's those smaller pieces that aren't around the edges. They're in the middle, and a lot of them have a tendency to look alike. And you got to find those people. And so that happens from a couple of things. You read everything you possibly can, and I mean everything. We read every book that had ever been written about Tiger. We read books on sex addiction. We read books on Navy SEALs, gifted children, business of golf, all those things, because you're trying to understand the person that portrait. And you make these enormous lists, and you start putting timelines together, because the thing with Tiger is you kind of know where all the off-road, the exit ramps are. But we were interested in the mile markers, the things that would take you to those exit ramps. And oftentimes, when you got in that middle area, you found people like Peggy Lewis, who is an amazing character in our book. She was the woman whose Tiger and Earl, the family, rented the house from at the Masters for years. No one had ever talked to Peggy. Peggy had a wonderfully insightful story to tell about Tiger and about how they basically just destroyed her home and never left a tip, and that sense of entitlement that comes with Earl Woods and Tiger Woods at certain parts of his life. The fact that Tiger never said thank you to Peggy at any time that he had ever stayed there, never left a gift. So those are little things. And then you go to a place like Las Vegas and you try to understand not only what Tiger was doing there, but what was happening in Las Vegas at the same time Tiger was intersecting with that city, when bottle service and that whole celebrity clientele just exploded, with Light and Tao and Pure and Jet and all these clubs that became the place to go. So you really feel like you're a detective. And I could not have done this book 10 years ago, even. As you mentioned, I had a pretty big reputation at Sports Illustrated as an investigative reporter, and I had done several other investigative books. But this took every last bit of my skills and Jeff's skills to not only do the reporting and finding these little, sometimes the little people that told you big things, members of the O'Meara family, Amber Loria, who was a niece of Mark and Alicia, and she intersected with Tiger a ton of times as he was in Isleworth, right after he turned pro. Those people had never been talked to. So what you get is that complete portrait, or as complete a portrait as you can put together without Tiger. But it's exhausting work. I mean, in the end, Jeff and I laughed, Simon & Schuster paid us a lot of money for the book, but we were working for minimum wage. I mean, there's no question. There was thousands and thousands and thousands of hours that we both put in.
And how did you, so if we've done, hundreds of interviews, you mentioned sort of putting together a timeline. I would think that would be one of the big challenges, is you have each person is giving you a certain number of years, or, a certain part of Tiger's life. And some of them are overlapping with the others, and sort of piecing that all together, I could imagine would take a long time.
It was, and I'd never done a timeline in a book before, and I'll never do another book without a timeline. In fact, I'm working on one now that is a wildly entertaining, interesting character. But he lived a very complicated life from the time his father died when he was 18 months old to he's 74 years old today. I couldn't understand his life without a timeline. And I think that's a really good thing for the people in this room to understand. You can't do it all the time because you don't have the time, but you have to understand sort of the arc and the architecture of people's lives. And it made writing the book so much easier, because in the end, Tiger hit that fire hydrant on Thanksgiving night in the wee hours after Thanksgiving in November of 2009. We knew he was headed off a cliff probably a year earlier, at least. And sooner or later, he was going to crash somewhere, because he was living 3 or 4 different lives at that point in time. So, A, finding the people, B, getting them to trust you and to believe in the goodness of the project, C, interviewing them, D, I transcribed all my own interviews because I wanted to immerse myself in what the person was telling me and not send them out to a transcription service and read them, because I just felt like I had a better feeling for the person when I was listening to their voice. That takes, I can't tell you how many hours. And that even before you write your first word. So it's not for the faint of heart. I believe I love books. My office, you can't see a lot of it. I started reading when I was, I read the most books when I was in 8th grade, and I was a better than average athlete. I love sports, but I read the most books when I was in 8th grade and junior high school. And that love of reading turned into a love of writing. And without the reading, I still read. I'm reading 2 or 3 books right now. I'm reading Obama's book. I'm reading another sort of, I love sort of the thrillers, those kinds of books, but I'm always reading. And with that reading comes an understanding of how to tell stories. And that's really what I am. I'm a storyteller. And that's, if I had to boil it down to the 4 words that Don Hewitt used to use at 60 Minutes all the time, tell me a story. And that's what I do. I tell stories for a living.
And one other question I had related to sort of the process, which I can imagine is something that happens more when you're dealing with a celebrity like Tiger Woods, is trusting your sources. That's obviously, as a journalist, your story is only as good as your sources.
Yes.
And did you find, how did you fact check or just evaluate the stories they're telling, and make sure it's not, oh, well, this is, Tiger's ex-lover. They're just saying, things because they want to be part of the project.
They have an axe to grind, all of those things. It's a lot of it is experience, I think is understanding that, your word is your bond. I like to tell people, you can say A and do B once or twice in your life, and you might become very famous for doing something that you promised somebody else that you wouldn't do. And I mean by revealing a source or reporting information someone has told you off the record, which leads me to a little bit of an aside. I don't work off the record with people because it doesn't do me any good. I have a clear understanding of what on the record is, on background is, and off the record. Certainly, I love on the record. I'm more than happy to work in many cases on background, sourcing that information in a way that the person is giving it to me feels comfortable in how I'm going to characterize the conversation or the attribution. Third, I don't work off the record because what does off the record do for me? You're telling me something I just cannot use in any way, shape, or form. So let's see if we can work it out where you feel comfortable allowing me to use the information and keeping your identity a secret. I did a lot of that high wire stuff. I've been doing it a long time. I mean, I've been on a tightrope, on a very high wire, going back to my days at SI. And, knock on wood over here, I haven't fallen off, and it's a long way down. And I think, as I said, if you say something, if you say A and you do B, you'll get away with it once or twice. You will not make a career on it. I can tell you, because I have relationships with certain people now, like Nick Saban and Bill Belichick, that were built on trust and on them watching my work ethic and watching the way I work. And if I didn't operate under a set of principles that they believed in, then they wouldn't be giving me the access that they provided me over the years. So I think it's a combination of things. It takes a long time. It took us a long time to get Dina Gravel, Tiger's first girlfriend, his first true love, to sit down for us with the book, and then to convince her to sit with the directors, which is a whole nother set of trust that you have to build. Jeff and I, because of our relationships and the trust that we had built with certain sources in the book, part of what we brought to the book was introductions to the directors and the producers, who could then form their own relationships and trust with the subjects. Because I sat in the chair for 5 hours for my interview. Rachel Yucatel was in the chair for 8 hours. Dina was in the chair for, I think, 5 or 6 hours. That doesn't happen unless somebody believes that you're trying to do the right thing.
Yeah, and I'll actually mention, so someone's got a question right now, since you talked about being in the chair. So Josh Mellinger says he's closely followed your amazing career and proud to call you a fellow Aztec. His favorite part of the documentary is when you drop the F-bomb towards the end. Yeah. And his question was that a nod to David Duvall's comment in 2018 or your own personal take?
That was my own personal take. I didn't know Duvall said it. And, I know that people have said that that David had said something similar to that. I was just in the moment. And I knew from the reporting that I had done on the Masters that, that there were pros that felt like they couldn't wait to get into that crucible when Tiger on a Sunday at a major. And, that's just my opinion. That's the last thing I think a lot of these guys now, understanding the full weight of what it's like to be at the Masters on the back nine on Sunday, that's the last place they want to be. So, I guess I'll give kudos to David because he was one of Tiger's greatest rivals and before he got hurt. But that was just me, venting, I guess, about probably 4.5 hours into that 5-hour interview.
And another question I had about both the book and the film is, it's about Tiger. I'm assuming you tried to get an interview with Tiger. Was there ever any interest, or was there always just?
No, there wasn't much interest. We knew, given his history with unauthorized projects that he doesn't have complete control over, that it was going to be a hurdle to get him to engage in any way, shape, or form. So when Jeff and I reached out, it was by letter to his agent and the person that was representing him at the time as his PR person, Glenn Greenspan. And we said we would just like to start the process about the possibility of an interview with Tiger, not an interview, just getting to the point where he might feel comfortable answering some questions. And as I said, at that time, I had won 11 Emmys. Jeff I had Tiger's the 4th book I've had on the New York Times bestseller list. Jeff has had at least 3 on the Times bestseller list. And what we got in response was this conditional letter that said, we need to know everyone that you've talked to. We need to know everything they told you, both on and off the record. And we need a list of questions that you need to provide us before we'll even consider responding. And Jeff and I were like, I'd worked at 60 Minutes and we've interviewed heads of state and presidents of the United States, and there were never those conditions placed on those interviews. So to think that we would, and I just found it to be demeaning, and disrespectful. All you have to say is, we're not interested in really collaborating or in engaging at all. But to try to it was just seemed really petty to me, and it seems small. Just, we're all professionals here. Just decline to do the interview. You don't have to give us give us journalism lessons, and that's really what the letter ended up being. We went back again, and in the end, Tiger did respond to one particular thing relative to the issue of performance enhancing drugs. He signed a letter, or he signed a statement that would allow his attorney to provide us with an on the record statement about the fact that he did not believe that Tiger had ever used performance enhancing drugs. So we did get a little engagement, but it was it took we had to leverage certain things in order to get that to come our way.
Great. We've got a few more questions related to the sources, and I'll summarize and read a few of them. One is just, again, any techniques or tips for developing that trust with sources. And then someone wondered about those people who'd gotten burned, whether you think there might have been a reckoning for them to help them process the pain they felt, or
I think there's
what may have motivated them.
Well, everybody has different motivations. Let me answer the second one first. Everybody has a different motivation for sitting down. I think some of those people had been profoundly hurt by Tiger, his actions over the years, no question. I think Dina Gravel, his first girlfriend, the way that she was cut out of Tiger's life by Earl and Tita, his father and mother, when she became essentially a threat. They were concerned that she might get pregnant. Tiger wanted to go to UNLV to play golf there. Dina was in Vegas. They did not want that to happen. And then if you've seen the doc, there's this very dramatic moment where she reads the letter that Tiger gave her, telling her he doesn't want to see her anymore. Stevie Williams, I think, felt very similar after 13 years as Tiger's caddy, all that they had been through together. As Stevie said, I understand if he wants to change caddies, but I didn't think we were going to change friends. I'd never be his friend again. I think Amber Loria, was really hurt by the fact that she listened to Tiger so many times when he was trying to process things. And then after he hit the fire hydrant, he turned off his phone and never returned any of her calls or texts. Joe Groman, who was the assistant pro at the Navy course. I think, once Tiger went to Stanford, he cut Joe out of his life. And Joe was there from the time Tiger was about 9 years old, 10 years old, to the time that he was headed to college. So everybody brings a different motivation. Our job was, and the director's job, certainly in the doc, is to pick and choose the moments, and B, the people that best tell the story that they feel answers the pathology and the complicated questions about Tiger Woods, and reveals the human side and the inspirational side and all of that. As far as sources are concerned, I've always found, honesty and integrity, and that goes a long way with people, treating people fairly and having empathy for what they're going through, and not, you get into a situation where sometimes you just, you're going so fast on stories that you kind of use people up. And that's just, as I've gotten older, and I thought a lot about this early in my career. Somebody just asked me this week the biggest single mistake I've made. And I think it was early on in my career, I was so obsessed. I used to be called like the bulldog that they would let out of my cage, at SI, and I'd go in 4, 5, 6 days, sometimes come back with information that would break news and make news. But there's a pathology to that too. And I think back on it, and I regret some of the things that I did in not acting properly, but just being so pathological about it, in sense of, I got to get to the bottom of this. I got to get the story, and people's feelings be damned sometimes. And that's just not the way it works, I think. So it takes time. They watch they watch how you work. They read what you write. If you say A and do A, well, then you're moving in the right direction. But it's a process. And I think you have to understand that it's a long term game. Developing sources, certainly in Washington on Capitol Hill or in Congress or within the White House, that takes years sometimes. And you just have to be yourself. And if you think that you're doing this because I want to make a name for myself, well, then you're in the wrong business. I think I've often said is that my stories kind of speak for themselves. I don't talk a lot about, certainly this is a different environment, but I don't spend a lot of time talking about my stories. I like those stories to speak for themselves because they say something about me. They say something about the way I work. And to me, that's always a more powerful way to speak, rather than having a bullhorn and saying, well, here's my hot take for the day. It just doesn't work for me. I don't know, other people have different opinions about it, but that's just the way I've been.
Great. I want to take a break for a moment from from Tiger Woods in general, and go back to the 1970s. You're a student at SDSU. You're writing for the Daily Aztec. Can you tell us, what were your experiences there, and how did that help anything from your college days set you on, the trajectory for your career?
Well, I mean, I came to San Diego State in 1973. I transferred from Central Michigan, which is in Mount Pleasant, Michigan, as we like to call it at times, unpleasant Michigan, particularly in the wintertime. I was a baseball player. I played at San Diego State when Jim Dietz was the coach. Some of those guys on the team are still my very best friends. Randy Hansen, who was our left fielder, is my best friend to this day. Dave Smith, who passed away several years ago, who pitched for the Astros, was a very good friend of mine. Jack Hacker, our catcher. Those guys I'm still close to. But I was writing as well. I was writing for the Daily Aztec. I had 2 journalism professors there, Jim Buchwald and James Julian, who were enormously influential on my career. Jim Bucklew, because he had worked in television and was the kind of the living, breathing embodiment of, oh, this is what a producer does. This is like the level that you want to get to. And James Julian was a curmudgeonly, those kind of kindly, curmudgeonly professors who taught media law and media ethics. And his class was notorious as being the toughest class in the journalism school. And I got a B in that class. And I remember I was so proud of the B because he just didn't give out a lot of A's. But it was really the ethics of the business. And so, I wrote a lot for the paper at Central Michigan. It's called CMU Life. I wasn't writing as much for the Daily Aztec, but the stories I were doing were bigger stories, like what it takes to get into law school, and then those days, the pressures and the heightened anxiety that was filled around taking that LSAT and all of that. So, but what that gave me was a foundation that when I graduated, my first real job was at the Life News, which was a shopper that they would toss on people's doorsteps on Wednesday afternoon that was really mostly ads. And there was a sports section, and I was the sports editor. And the only reason I could be the sports editor was because I was the only one in the sports department. So it was me and me. And I took the pictures and I wrote the headlines. I laid out the pages. I covered high school sports. And I was the sports editor because I get to call myself the sports editor. I was there for 4 months. And then I had an opportunity came up for a job in Escondido at the Times Advocate, now defunct Times Advocate, which became eventually merged with the Oceanside Blade Tribune into the North County Times. But it was a suburban daily. You wrote every day. And I figured out really quickly as to whether this was, you learn real quickly as to whether this is what you really want. You think you want to be a journalist, you think you want to be a sports writer, but when you finally jump into the deep end of the pool, you're like, oh, am I going to sink or swim here? And do I really like being in the water? And I was there for 2 years and I loved it. But I also I was looking at the writers from the San Diego Union and Tribune and projecting myself. At that time, I was 25 years old, projecting myself another 10 or 15 years down the line. I'm like, God, is this really how I want to look and how I want to, this is the job I want? And so I left. I actually left after 2 years, took a break. I came back to San Diego. And I worked with a public relations company in Pacific Beach called the Phillips Organization to see what maybe PR is what I wanted to do. And I learned right away I didn't want to be in the PR business, but I had an appreciation from being in the PR business what that job was like. And that has helped me in relationships I have with people in the PR world, high-end PR world now, and knowing what it's like from their side. And then sort of the last thing, Temple, is I had ambition, and there's nothing wrong with being ambitious. And I was sending my stories back to Sports Illustrated, the ones that at the Escondido Times Advocate, but I began to freelance for the San Diego Union and San Diego Magazine. And I would send those stories back to SI to see if I could get a job as a reporter, which was a glorified fact-checking job. Quick story. The magazine rarely hired people in those days. If one person every 3 or 4 years was hired as a reporter, and I used to look at that masthead like it was the Rosetta Stone and just go, okay, now so-and-so left. They're not there. There must be an opening. They offered me a job in February of 1982. My wife, who I've been married to now for 41 years, Dee Dee, was 8 months pregnant with our first child, Kristen, at that moment. It's 1982. New York is like Escape from New York, David Dinkins. It's a mess. So I had to turn that job down. My wife goes, I'm not moving to New York. We were married, a child on the way, two dogs, 2 cars, 2 jobs, living in North Park, right by Balboa Park. And I had to turn the job down. And I'm like, it took me a year to get the job offer. Now I'm turning it down. Nobody turned jobs down at Sports Illustrated. I did. And so 3 months later, I get another call. There'd been another opening, and they said to me, we're going to offer you this job again, but we're not offering it a third time. So make a decision. I took the job. Dee Dee stayed back in San Diego for like 3 months. I lived in New York with friends and slept in my office, just lived this kind of nomadic life. But the point being is I wanted to compete against the best. I figured I can always come back to San Diego, but I want to go up against the best in terms of the best writers in the country and the best reporters in the country. And I found a niche for myself. I made a niche for myself as an investigative reporter and writer for them. And the point being is, follow your dreams. You can always, I never was in this for the money. The money came down the line, but I loved what I was doing. I had great passion for what I was doing. And if there's anything that has sustained me over the years, is that I had this great passion for journalism and for storytelling. And that's what ultimately was the decider for me. I outworked people. When I was the chief investigative correspondent for CBS News, I would see these interns come in and they were looking at the clock, and as soon as the clock struck 5, they were out the door. There's no way those people would ever work at a network again. The fact that they got in the door was a surprise to me. So, the first person in, the last person out, trust me, people look at that, they see it. They're impressed by it. And when it time came to hire people in my unit, I went back to some of those interns and brought them in as broadcast associates or at the lowest level, but they were in the door.
That's a great transition, actually, to a question from Emma, who's one of our brand new majors. She wanted to know, what's your best advice for someone wanting to get involved in your field?
Well, I would say the word passion means a lot to me. And that, if you really want to do it, then I think you have to jump in with both feet and attempt to better yourself every single day. That Nick Saban talks about the pursuit of perfection. Well, you're never going to find perfection, but the pursuit of it is what is important. I will say, and you and I were talking about this earlier, Temple, is about, everything is changing. I understand the digital world and the world we live in now with social media is very different than what I came up in the Watergate days and the Woodward and Bernstein days, the David Halberstam days. But that doesn't mean there isn't opportunity. But I will say this, and I believe this from the bottom of my heart, is there are components that don't change. You have to be able to report. You have to be able to learn how to interview. There's a skill to interviewing, and I'm more than happy at some point in time to talk about that, because I think I could teach a class in interviewing skills and what it's like to prepare for an interview. Watch those 60-minute interviews, and I did at least a dozen pieces, or I think of 10 pieces for them. They're 2 hours, 2.5 hours long, those interviews. You have to prepare for them like you're going into not battle, but you have to be almost, you have to be so flexible when somebody goes in one direction, you go with them. You don't bring them back and say, okay, we'll get to that. And then finally, it's really the reporting, it's the interviewing and the writing. Those are all skills that, yes, some people are great. They're gifted being great writers, but it's a skill that you can learn. And the more you do it, the better you get at it. And if you can't, no matter what your career path takes you, I think if you can tell a story, if you can write an argumentative letter to the credit card company, or maybe somebody that did you wrong in terms of Amazon or something like that, that's a skill set. And that skill set will transfer everywhere, whether you're in real estate, whether you're on Wall Street, whether you're working on Main Street. To be able to write and to be inquisitive and to get to the bottom of things and details, I think the idea of just being able to have those three, if you walk out of San Diego State and out of the journalism in the mass media studies department in with those kinds of qualities, no matter where you go, I think it's gonna be a benefit down the line. And take a job. Don't, what I always said to people like, oh, I'd love your job. Well, yeah, of course you would love my job. It's a great job. It took me, in many cases, to get to SI, that was 1982. I had been in the journalism business really since I was 17 years old, in Michigan, writing for the local Birmingham eccentric. So I would just say, yeah, you want that job, but don't be afraid to take a lesser job or take a first job and work as hard as you can and see where that takes you.
Donna has a great follow-up question, I think. And this is one I always enjoy hearing answers to. It's when you think about your professional work, your career, what's one thing or something you wish you knew or implemented early on in your career that you've learned along the way?
Well, that's a good question. And that's going to take a minute to think about. Wish I known that I would take along the way. I think, I don't know. That's a really, I don't say I don't know very often, but I think the idea, I think versatility, like for the younger generation now, I think you should be able to, not just all the things I just talked about, but to edit and to shoot and to be able to storytell in every kind of medium, whether it's podcasts, or whether it's short form videos. I think the more the more valuable you are. I guess one of my biggest regrets is I spent a lot of time away from my family for a long time. I would go on these jags for SI where I would be gone for a couple of weeks at a time. I could have been in Nebraska. I could have been someplace else. When I was covering the NFL and working for the NFL Today and working for Inside the NFL on HBO and doing Real Sports and writing books, if I was home 1 or 2 days a week, that was a big deal. And my daughters who they used to laugh when I walked in the door, like, oh, Dad's here. And they called it the reentry program. I would come in and try to be a father in the goodness of my heart, just trying to say, would you just pick up your room? And they're like, what? Why are you? You have no standing here. You're not here. So I think it's worked out well in the end. But I think I would have been more cognizant of how much my family suffered, I think, or at least I think they suffered. I'm not sure. Maybe that was a good thing. But that obsessiveness that I had, I probably would have dialed that back a little bit. But that's hard to say because it got me where I am today.
Yeah, and so another related question, John Freeman says, you've obviously come a long way since Tuned In magazine back in the 70s.
Oh my
Kidding.
God.
And so he said, looking back on your terrific career, what are you most proud of? And then can you give us any insights onto what your next project is?
I think I'm most proud of is, I think I'm most proud of my reputation, that I'm considered to be, and I hope I'm not speaking too highly of myself here, but when it's an Armen Keteyian story, it has a certain feeling to it. It has a certain quality to it. It has a certain level of integrity to it. I often say to people, I said, the one thing that you can control is your good name. And in this day and age, with social media and Twitter and how people can see their reputations utterly destroyed in a matter of hours. I've been fortunate enough that I haven't ever gone through something like that. And I've worked on some very, very high profile stories and investigations. And I've never so much as taken a deposition in my life for anything. So I think that I'm most proud of that I have the reputation that I have now in the business, because that means something to me and it carries weight with people. and so I guess I guess that's it. That's the thing I'm most proud of, that I'm 67 years old and I'm still around. And my next project, well, there's a couple of them. One, the Tiger doc, as you mentioned, there's a scripted series that's in the works based on the book. So that's been really exciting to work with a very skilled Hollywood screenwriter who just finished the pilot this week, the second version of the pilot. Well, it's actually version 21, but it's the second one that I've seen. It's very good. It's very different than the doc. I mentioned this book that I'm working on. I can't say who it is because he's asked me not to talk about it publicly, but it's a powerhouse kind of story. It's a rags to riches Horatio Alger tale. The rise from almost nothing to where he is today. It's got a San Diego connection to it, so that's nice. I've been back out to see my best friend Randy Hansen and Nora, his wife, and our best friends, and so I can pal around with some of my friends in San Diego. And then it's weird. I mean, this week, I had worked on a Steve McNair story on the death of the Titans superstar quarterback and whether he was murdered by his 20-year-old girlfriend or not. It just made no sense to me. And one of the streaming services called me this week and said, "Hey, that McNair story, who has, where is that?" I said, "Well, it's a big box in my office right now." And they said, "Are you interested in doing like a docuseries based on that story?" And I said, "Yeah, I'd be interested in something like that." So, at a certain point in my life, it was interesting. I was the anchor and executive producer for The Athletic, the digital sports media company, for about 18 months. And I produced with my two partners 40 stories and 400 minutes of television. It's as hard as I've ever worked. And honestly, it's some of the best stuff I've ever done. But when the pandemic hit, we didn't survive the pandemic. And I thought, oh man, now what am I going to do? I'm 66 years old. Is this the end? And I thought it was a tough transition for me for a little while. But then I just thought, you know what? This is an opportunity. Take a breath. You deserve it. Let's just see what comes over the transom. And it's been really heartening just to not have to hustle for anything that people, I guess 35 years worth of work and whatever that body of work has put together. Once the word got out that, I was available for things, the phone rang, and it's kind of kept ringing, which is good. I know my wife likes that.
Well, Brandon has an interesting related question, which is, have there been any pitches or stories that you wanted to do that you were never able to find a place for it?
There's if Brandon was it was here in Fairfield, Connecticut, I could take him up to the attic in my garage, and I still retain I've ventured to say hundreds of files of stories that I worked on, many of them that go all the way back to my days at Sports Illustrated, which is another thing that I think is maybe a bit of advice for people is, I'm not a pack rat in that, I guess, hoarder kind of term, but I keep all the major stories I've ever done, and even some of them that weren't so major, I've kept them over the years. And, a couple of them turned into books. And that's really interesting because, yeah, there's probably 10 or 12 stories that I've worked on that I think would be phenomenal, either docuseries or scripted series or films. And I've had people talk to me about certain ones. Hollywood's is a weird place, that, and I've kind of learned that whatever's going to happen is going to happen. I have the material, and I think people now, there's a certain group of producers because of Alex Gibney and some of the work I've been, around for the last couple of years. They're like, "Do you have anything else?" I mean, and I'm like, "Well, yeah, I do." And so that's been nice too, is to know that saving all this stuff, there's a reason I saved it, because I never knew when it was going to come back around again. And in a lot of cases now, I mean, some of the biggest stories I've ever worked on, I knew would I thought would make a great film. And those conversations are beginning now.
And how do you handle, I think, as a journalist or anyone working in the media, when you put something out there, you get criticism often. You'll often get praise as well, but you'll hear from either the people in the sources or people who disagree with whatever you're writing about, maybe ardent Tiger fans angry at the ways being portrayed. How do you handle the both positive, but really thinking about the negative reactions that
Well, it's
come
hard,
from doing anything public like this?
it's hard when you pour your heart into something, and somebody attacks it for no good reason sometimes, or because they have an agenda, or maybe they're, in cahoots with somebody that has a different, is a rival in a certain way. Especially now, I don't know, honestly, the way social media is and the way Twitter is, if I could handle it, because it can be vicious in some of the comments that people make. I mean, I crossed swords with some of those Ohio State fans when Urban Meyer was going through what he was going through there with Zach Smith, the assistant coach. And I said a few things about, how I found it to be incredible that Urban wouldn't know what was going on with a member of his own coaching staff who happened to be, and his wife was talking to Zach Smith's wife. And I just got annihilated by the Ohio State fans. And they said stuff about me, which I was sort of okay with, but they said stuff about my wife and my family that I just found to be deplorable. And so I'm a sensitive person. I think part of what drives me as a journalist is that I'm empathetic, I'm passionate, I'm sympathetic. And when you pour your heart into something and people for their own agendas or own reasons just bury you or criticize you, it's hard to take. And I sometimes I don't even look at the Twitter feed. Like right now with, Barstool, I did a big Barstool foreplay interview yesterday with Riggs and his buddies. And, it's been well received in social media, but it could just as well have gone the other way. And I could be sitting here today going, I don't even want to look at my phone because I know what's on the other side of that when I hit that screen. And I just think you have to be, you have to put on a pair of big boy pants and just say, okay, you're in the arena here. This comes with it. And I've been very careful publicly not to try to get into pissing matches with people because I don't think it does anybody any good, particularly from a journalist's point of view. I mean, I will defend my stories when like the book came out, Mark Steinberg said some things about it, that it was dated and full of egregious errors. It was A, not dated, and B, not full of egregious errors. And I'm not going to let him try to take the high ground on something like that and say, this book is X, Y, and Z when I know damn well what the book is. And I'll defend that. But man, I don't know. The rest of it is, I'm sort of glad I'm at the age I'm at right now, because if I was 30 or 40 years younger, I don't know what I would do.
You mentioned earlier about teaching a class, specifically when we're thinking about interviewing. So Stephen asks if you modeled your interviewing style after anyone when you were first starting out. And I'll add, and just, how have you developed your style and what's your approach?
That's a really good question. I was a big 60 Minutes, viewer growing up and working there, and being around, that group of correspondents were some of the best interviewers in the business. Mike Wallace had a certain style, and it was pretty much, we all know that was, he's charging ahead. I always found myself really watching Ed Bradley, and I would give the advice of anybody who wants to learn how to interview people to watch Ed Bradley's interviews on 60 Minutes. he loved jazz. And Ed's interviews were like jazz. They were orchestral in the way that he would just flow with the interview subject. And the reason Ed could do that was Ed was so well prepared. He had read all the research. And one of the things that I do, I mean, I would get a briefing book sometimes, you know, for an interview that would have like that much information in it or more. And I would have to absorb all that. And then I would move, you know, I always said it would just come into my head. It would stay for as long as it needed to stay. And then it would blow out and something else would come in. But I had that, I would annotate those books. And then the producer would write questions. And then I would write my own questions based on what the producer said and what I wanted to do. And those questions, in terms of an interview, they had a pattern to them. There was an architecture to them. And the way I would start, and perhaps the most difficult questions were maybe 2/3 of the way through, 3/4 of the way through the interview. But then the back end would be an attempt to at least come to, you know, a peace agreement in some way, shape, or form after I had asked some very direct questions. But that doesn't mean in interviews, if somebody wanted to start talking about, you know, there's a apocryphal tale, but I think it's probably true, of a certain correspondent was sitting with a person, and they were talking about, you know, growing up, and the person said, well, you know, after I shot my father, you know, right in front of my mother, that just changed my life. And the correspondent said, yeah, I'm going to get to that in a second, but let's go back to when you were a cheerleader in high school, kind of a thing. And you're like, how in the world can you do that? When the person starts to talk about a moment in their life that dramatically changes their life, you have to be ready to go with them in that moment, because that's what 60 Minutes is built on. It's built on moments, one on top of another, on top of another, on top of another. And if you don't know how to hold those moments as a correspondent, now don't forget, these are 2 cameras, real-time interviews. So you can't be shuffling your papers. You can't be hemming and hawing. You have to be there. And I would always describe them as conversations. You know, people say, oh, I interviewed so-and-so, but the great 60 Minutes interviews are conversations with people, and that's what you're shooting for. But that just comes from when I've been interviewed by people who don't have the foggiest notion of my career or where I was born or maybe what I've done in my life, I'm not going to give those people any more than basically the time of day. But when somebody shows up and does the research that you've done, or others that have interviewed me who know things, and the tuned in thing, I got to believe that's somebody who went way back. That's Johnny Rogers and Tuned In Magazine. You know, those are the ones where the person you can see the person on the other side or across from you go, oh, you're giving me the respect that I deserve, or you took the time to learn about me. So when I'm here talking to you, I don't feel like I'm talking to a blank wall. And I think that to me is the most important thing. The preparation to me was everything, because when I would go into those interviews, and the other thing I would do is I didn't grandstand the interviews. I would ask a very direct question, but it would be fact-based, or it would be, well, why would you do something like that? And then if somebody said, well, what do you mean? And then I would say, well, at that point in time, you'd already stolen, you know, $15 million from the savings and loan, but you decided to go back and steal another 15 million, like it wasn't enough for you. Whatever that moment is, but it's you, there's facts in the question. So the person knows that I'm not just flailing around here and looking for some sensational soundbite. I want to get some answers. And I think if you treat people professionally and with respect, and you don't grandstand the interview and make it about you, you're going to get a lot more out of them than not.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we're about to, you know, the ending point for our time together. And so I wanted to end, and you've answered this somewhat, but it came up again in one of the questions, which is just any other advice you have for people who are trying to get into the media field on how can you stand out, and any just sort of final thoughts?
I think you stand out by being yourself. I don't think you can create a persona. I mean, Stephen A. Smith has created a persona for himself. He's done very well at ESPN. You know, the hot take artists that, you know, everybody's got an opinion on something these days. I think you got to learn the basics. You know, there's fundamentals to journalism, just like there's fundamentals to every other sport and every other business. Treat people like you want to be treated. You know, there's no substitute. I know this sounds like I'm your father, but there's no substitute for hard work. You know, my father, the best piece of advice he ever gave me was, if you work hard, people will notice. Hard work still works in no matter what business you're in. And the hardest workers are the ones that I believe are going to get the opportunities. And when those opportunities are presented to you, do everything you can to live up to that opportunity. You know, don't think it's going to come around again. My career was basically, I went from SI to ABC News. I never spent a day in local television, but I was prepared as a reporter and a writer when that opportunity arrived, and I threw myself into it when I was at ABC News. I could have easily failed there because I really didn't know television, but I did everything I could to learn television from the people that were the best in the business. So, you know, don't despair. I mean, no, it's really hard right now. I understand that. The jobs are shrinking. Local television is shrinking. The regional and the local newspapers are shrinking. There's consolidation everywhere, but open your eyes to opportunities, because the digital world, the streaming services, whether it's public relations, whatever it is that you're interested in, you know, finding a job is a job. You know, that's the hard part, is finding the job. It's hard these days, but it doesn't mean they're not out there. And, you know, if I can help anybody from my end, I'm more than willing to do that. My time at San Diego State was absolutely critical to my success in terms of what I learned and how proud I am to be a graduate. And I'll help anybody from my end who shows me that they're willing to put in the effort on their end.